Hello and welcome to the first video lesson of the course Brain Training, Speed Reading and Study Technique. First of all, we will briefly examine the functioning of the human brain, the location of the natural capacity that allows us to visualize and remember. Having understood the structure and function of the mind, it will then be possible to exercise its basic capabilities in accordance with our needs. The human brain is divided into two hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. These two sections of the brain are connected by a central unit called the corpus callosum. Each hemisphere deals with the management of different mental activities. The left side, green, manages operations that can be classified as logical. For example, everything related to the management of numbers, language, the creation and organization of lists, processes of analysis, etc. While the right side, blue, manages everything related to visualization and imagination. For example, the recognition of colors, the surrounding environment, spatial body relations, etc. In most cases, people seem to have one side or hemisphere that is dominant in the management of all cerebral activities. The predominance of one hemisphere instead of another is dictated solely by individual learning preferences. The brain will utilize the hemisphere and therefore the modality of learning that we prefer. During the learning of any concept or notion, every individual will utilize mainly that part of the brain with which they feel best able to reason and operate. Now let's look in detail at how each hemisphere is organized. Each cerebral hemisphere is divided into a further 4 components, as can be seen in the illustration. At the back of the human brain is located the occipital lobe that manages the visual sense. In the area directly behind the ears is located the temporal lobe, which is involved in the organization and processing of sounds, the functioning of the memory, the voice, and emotions. In the upper area are located the parietal lobes that manage some specific sensory information such as touch, the awareness of the body and its movements, pain, pressure, and body temperature. Our sense of spatial awareness and navigation also depends on this area. Behind the front, we find the frontal lobes that are considered the home of individual personality. The upper part of the frontal lobe manages the human capacity for problem solving, the activation of spontaneous responses, the recovery of memories, and the control of emotive, social, and sexual impulses. This area is much more developed in the human brain than in other animal species. Within each hemisphere, between the different cerebral folds, can be found the structure that forms the so-called limbic system. This system also includes specific cerebral elements such as the amygdala, hypothalamus, the thalamus, and hippocampus. These areas are reserved for and dedicated to the management of emotions, of stimuli and instincts, i.e., all of those tools necessary for individual survival. The amygdala, in particular, activates emotional responses such as euphoria and fear. The hypothalamus forms the control center for brain-body connections and vice versa. The increase in blood pressure when we are agitated depends precisely on hypothalamus. The thalamus, meanwhile, receives the visual and audio impulses and sends them for processing in the cerebral cortex. The hippocampus represents a fundamental element for the recognition of the spatial organization of what we observe, while it plays a fundamental role in cerebral operations of memorization. In the posterior part of the brain, at the bottom, can be found the cerebellum. This area is utilized to manage the movement of the body and general sense of balance. Together with the brainstem, the cerebellum makes up the part of the human brain that evolves before the others. Precisely this final area, together with the brainstem, serves to control the primary and involuntary functions of the body, such as respiration and digestion. The neurons are the cells inside the nervous system that transmit information through electrochemical impulses. They make up the base components of the brain and the spinal cord. Groups of neurons exist that are specialized according to their functions. For example, the sensory neurons allow us to sense determinate sensations, while the sensory motors allow us to perform actions with our bodies. All of the neurons, in order to function, must respond to a determinate stimulus and communicate the presence of this to the central nervous system, and therefore to the main parts of the brain that process and manage all of the information. The brain will consequently send the instructions to the body in order to carry out determinate actions. Each neuron is connected to approximately a further 10,000 neurons through specific cellular elements known as dendrites. The dendrites are the elements of the neural cells that deal with the reception of impulses. The axons are those neural elements that deal with the transmission of these impulses. The axons are not directly connected to one another, but can, however, communicate. When the neurons communicate, the distance between them is annulled and filled by the so-called neurotransmitters that are responsible for the movement of impulses of electrical signals. The myelin sheath acts as an isolator, increasing the speed and efficiency of the electrical impulses transported. Human intelligence concerns all of the multiple abilities of analysis, evaluation, imagination, and invention, and therefore it represents the fundamental element that allows us to concentrate on any given action. Different aspects or fields of intelligence exist, some regarding the capacity for reasoning and planning. People's intelligence can also be characterized by a specific ability of adaptation to environmental changes and the ability for interpersonal communication. In 75% of cases, what we learn through observation. So around 75% of what we learn derives from our visual sense. Through our visual sense, the brain allows us to create a memory of what we have seen. Having said this, as far as learning is concerned, the human visual sense is without doubt the most utilized, the most useful, and the most powerful of the senses. Observing, for example, this image, what is it possible to see? Look at the illustration for a few seconds. Within the image, we can find two different images. Observing another image, what is it possible to see? Look at this illustration for a few seconds. In the image, we can again find two different images. The visual sense allows us, through observation, to see both, while the brain will conserve the memory of these.